Now, as you can see, the P1 planetaries there are retained to the one of the multiple disc brakes via the snap ring, and of course this must be removed in order to pick up the P1 planetary. You'll notice that the P1 planetary is actually, through this, is going to be coupled to the P2 internal gear. And this is going to be a pretty busy member, because it either can be anchored to the case or anchored to the turbine shaft, so it's either held or driven. And here we see the multiple disc clutch assembly. It's going to lock the P1 planetary to the turbine shaft. And so here we've done an initial teardown of the 9G-Tronic. The actual disassembly of the pump and the P1 planetary's brake will be covered in another video. Be very careful of the case vent, and we'll also show a method of separating the case from the stator support there to replace or service this Teflon coated aluminum plate. Okay, at this point what we've done is we've gone through and rebuilt individual components, going through here and actually replacing the aluminum gasket that's Teflon coated on each side. Sometimes this can be safely reused. Gone through and carefully inspected the pump. We have our Torlon sealing rings. These are easily replaced, and as you can see, they can be disassembled and reassembled. In the teardown video, we're showing basically the components being taken apart, and then in the build-up video we're showing reassembling of the transmission. A separate video, as we mentioned, will go through how we would actually compress the spring, remove the L-shaped snap ring, and inspect the... This is actually a bonded piston, so there's not a separate sealing ring. The actual elastomer that provides the lip-type seal is actually part of the piston and serviced as an assembly. Inspection of the Torrington bearing and replacement of the seal have already been done. Now for reassembly, we start off, this is a dish type steel that goes against the piston, and Mercedes likes to use the dish, and the dish, of course, obviously the lip of the dish faces down. This gives a little bit of a cushion there to the actual apply. Now on some of these what's happened is there's an uneven spacing, so obviously this slips in only one way. Here we're going to go ahead and set in the clutch that's going to connect the P1 planetary to the turbine shaft. Here we're going to go ahead and set in the actual cushioning spring there for the multiple disc clutch that's the brake for the P1 planetary. Mercedes likes to use a dish type spring, and of course obviously we want the bowl of the dish pointing down. And on some of the assemblies, of course, there's an uneven spacing, so there's only one way or a couple of ways that spring will move into position, and here we see the corresponding clutch stack. Obviously a steel is always going to go against the spring. Okay, go ahead. Okay, at this point I'm ready to install the P1 planetary. over the driving clutch. I will connect the P1 planetary to the turbine shaft. You'll notice that I have the Torrington bearing retained. Don't have to worry about holding it in. Don't have to worry about it falling out. Now we're ready to go ahead and assemble the multiple disc brake. I have to do this afterward because the lip there of the P1 planetary will prevent me from going past the clutch. So here we go. We see our first steel going there against the spring. And remember, Mercedes likes to use the dish type spring. The bowl of the dish will always face down. So we see a steel, friction, steel, friction, steel, friction. Soaking the friction clutches in transmission fluid, there's certain schools of thought on that. These obviously have been thoroughly soaked in transmission fluid, as this transmission has been in service for about 1,300 miles. And then here we see this spring, the snap ring. And normally this can just simply be inserted by hand. Sometimes a slight coaxing with a screwdriver is in order, but there we go. In a separate video, we'll go through air checking each foot of the individual clutches. Okay, here we see the P1 internal gear. Here we see the P1 planetary. The P1 planetary is actually going to spline there to the P2 internal gear. Now, this is hidden down in this housing. I'm going to have to line these teeth up correctly, and it will be obvious as this comes down into position. You'll notice that I have a plastic lubrication director that's going to direct lubricating transmission fluid there to the individual planets in the planetary carrier. This actually has an inner and outer O-ring that will help direct the lubrication to the planetaries. Now this is a little tricky to put together. Of course, there's been a lot of practice here in doing this, but you'll know that it goes all the way down. There we go. So there it has seated completely. As we assemble the case, and we'll point this out, there should be no gap whatsoever between the case and the aluminum gasket. Should go down snugly. If there's any space at all, you haven't assembled something correctly. Okay, here we're getting ready to insert the turbine shaft into the P1 planetary and stator support. You'll notice the Torlon sealing rings and the Torrington style roller bearings, completely getting away from the conventional bushing. Here to improve fuel economy, I'm going to keep the rolling resistance as low as possible. And here we're ready to install the P1 internal gear. P1 planetary actually splines to the P2 internal gear, internal within this assembly. P2 sun gear can either be locked to the case or allowed to turn freely via one of the disc brake clutches. We have a disc driving clutch that's within this assembly that will of course be talked about and shown during a component rebuild. This is an assembly. Here we see the lubrication guide that's directing transmission fluid there to the needle bearings of the 3 planetary pinions. Now, what's going to happen is that the P1 planetary must be indexed correctly with the P2 internal gear. It's a little tricky to assemble. We found that the best way is to make sure you have plenty of lubricant on the O-rings and install the lubrication guide first, and then carefully position P1 internal gear and just carefully rotate until it comes into alignment. And you got to push it down through the O-rings and make sure that it's properly seated. As we install the case over the gear train, the case should come down snug against the gasket. If it does not, then what's happened is something is misaligned. Now we're ready to install the P3 internal gear. Note that the Torrington bearings are captured. Don't have to worry about retaining them with lubricant. Takes a moment just to get the components lined up. Here we have the P4 planetary. Splines there directly to the input shaft. Here we see the P4 internal gear, and it's going to have to index correctly with one of the driving clutches that will connect the P4 internal gear to the output shaft. The output shaft is always splined to the P3 planetary gear train. Alright, we had just carefully marked it so I know that it's seated correctly. So she should have seated all the way down. In the case we have a needle bearing. Here we see the two Torrington sealing rings, and here we see where the ball bearing will seat. There is no shim of any type there between the yoke or between the bearing and the output shaft. Now at this point we'll go ahead and slip the case over to cover actually the rebuilding of the two clutch assemblies and their pistons, and a separate video that talks about working with the case. Now I'm ready to slip the case down over the gear train. Okay, and after initially aligning the two multiple disc brakes in the case, we're going to go ahead and set the whole case down on the gear train. There isn't any type of locating dowel. However, obviously I've got to align the case with the pump. 2 aluminum bolts, and then we can tip the case up and install the remaining 16 aluminum bolts. And remember that the torque on this is going to be very small. It's going to be measured in inch-pounds. Aluminum into aluminum, aluminum into magnesium. It doesn't take much to ring that bolt in two. Okay, here we're just gently running down 2 aluminum bolts. I'm just going to barely make them snug. I'll give the final torque after installing the 16 bolts there in the front. Okay, now we're ready to install the 16 bell housing bolts. They're all the same length. They're T45. And they're all aluminum.